I'm delighted to welcome you all to the fifth talk in the series for Tech for Thought. Tech for Thought is a series of 6 public lectures on technology and policy hosted by Plaksha University in partnership with Carnegie, India. The mission for Tech for Thought is to build a foundational understanding of the key emerging technologies that are and will significantly impact the lives of the 21st century, and to discuss the underlying policies, laws, ethics, and regulatory framework that the regulatory frameworks, particularly in the Indian context. We'll also touch upon the ethical implications of these technologies. For the session today, we are delighted to have with us 2 outstanding and eminent leaders in this field. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Alexandra Zefiroglu, Professor and Deputy Director of the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University, and Dr. Jagannath Raju, Founder and CTO of Cybernetics. Dr. Zefiroglu is a Professor and Deputy Director of the School of Cybernetics, also a Fellow of the ANU Futures Scheme. She is a cultural anthropologist by training. She received a doctorate from Brown University and joined Intel soon after in 1994. She held various roles across the company in the digital home, client computing, Internet of Things, and intelligent transport systems. After a 15-year successful career in Intel, she joined ANU to co-found the School of Cybernetics, perhaps and arguably the first of its kind in the world. Dr. Jagannath Raju is the CTO and founder of Cybernetics, based out of Bangalore, India. After completing his BTech from IIT Madras, he got a master's from UC Berkeley and a doctorate from MIT. Dr. Raju was instrumental in developing several innovative robotic solutions for applications in space, underwater, and hazard management. He repatriated to India in 1993 and soon founded Cybernetics. His high-tech robotics company focuses on sensible robotics, a philosophy that reduces cost and complexity through innovative design, making its products available, easy to use, and ideal for widespread deployment. If you will, Alex and Jagannath, please allow me to take a couple of minutes to set the stage for this session. The confluence and the convergence of several key technologies have unleashed Industry 4.0. While previous industry revolutions have liberated humankind from animal power, let's say the steam engine, mass production possible through electricity revolution, and brought digital capabilities, billions of people through computers and internet, the fourth industrial revolution is, however, fundamentally different, I believe. It's characterized by a range of new technologies that are fusing the physical, digital, and even the biological worlds, and impacting all disciplines, economies, and industries, and even challenging some of the ideas we have about what it means to be human. The availability of micro and nano electromechanical sensors and systems, the advent of ultra-fast and compact computers, the ease of integration of cyber-physical systems, access to big data, and finally, the development of AI-based algorithms has led to a paradigm shift in manufacturing and indeed the future of work. Today's conversation will throw some light on how robots have influenced humans in society over time from a cultural and technological perspective. We'll also look at the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead in this domain in the years to come. It's indeed a very opportune moment for such a discussion, as smart robots are already here, and it's therefore critical for humans and robots to meaningfully coexist. This is going to be an interactive session, and we intersperse the question and answer sessions across the talk. There'll be a couple of breaks in the middle so the audience can participate. We request everyone to please have their video switched on and mics muted, and use the raised hand function to ask questions in the Q&A session. Please feel free to put up some questions in the chat as and when they come to your mind, and we will curate it and ask them later. It's my pleasure now to welcome Alex and Jagannath. Thank you really for doing this and sparing your time in your busy schedules. Over to you to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rama. I'm Alex Zefiroglu. As Rama introduced me, I am a professor and deputy director of the School of Cybernetics at ANU. And I wanted to start today by first saying thank you so much to Plaksha University for inviting me to take part in this talk. And especially to Rama and Dissidant, who have done a lot of coaching and conversations with Jagannath and I over the last few weeks to bring this together. I also want to start by paying my respects to the elders past and present of the traditional owners of the land on which I am meeting you or joining you from, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I am in the Australian Capital Territory in Australia, and this is a spot where technology innovation has been happening for at least the past 60,000 years, and where people have been living in harmony with nature and in cybernetic ways for at least that long. If we could go to the next slide, please. What we wanted to do today was to talk to you a little bit about humans and robots, past, present, and future. Excellent. It's coming. There it is. Slowly. There we go. What I wanted to do today to start us off was to provide one framing of humankind's engagement with robotics. It's a framing that allows us to see patterns across eras in geography and to visit enduring intents and goals of humans and robots. In focusing on these intents and these goals, I want to invite us to consider not just the what of robotics and the how of robotics, but also the why and what our motivations and incentives suggest for what our futures may hold. This framing complements and builds on the perspectives that are going to be provided by Jago. I have Dr. Raju written in the notes, and now I have a hard time saying that. But in our presentation today, we're going to share the virtual stage, and so we're going to be passing back and forth to one another as we consider the past, presence, and futures of robotics in India and globally. But what I wanted to do was start off with a small provocation and a riff on the title of a book that I suspect many of you may have read, namely Henry Petroski's To Engineer is Human. In the book, which is really about failures in engineering, Petroski argues that engineering is synonymous with design, which he defines as making something that has not existed before. And it's this process of design in which diverse parts of what he's considering the given world or the natural world or the world around us that we've inherited from our ancestors. So the kind of given world of the scientist and the man-made world of the engineer are reformed and assembled into something the likes of which nature had not dreamed, and that divorces engineering from science and marries it to art. And I always like this quote because it reminds us that engineering is as much about designing things that are new and thinking about things that are new and imagining things that are new, and that this act of imagination is also an act of art, and it is also very much social and cultural, which of course is a perspective that you will get from a cultural anthropologist. What I want to do though is to riff on Petroski's idea that engineering is human, instead to ask us to consider that to imagine and design and build robots is human. And what might I mean by this? So if we go to the next slide, what I wanted to invite us to do was to take a moment to close our eyes and consider what comes to mind when we think about robots and robotics. And to think about what is it that we see when we think robots, and also what might it be that we smell or hear or feel, that it's not only about sight. And when I've done this with other groups, what most often comes up in discussions afterwards is that people describe one of two things, or a combination of the following two things. The first is that they describe machines that are made by humans that display agency. So they act and they move in the physical world, and most often they act in some respects like humans or other biological life forms. Or the second way that people talk about or think about robots or imagine robots is that they're machines that are made by humans that display a level of autonomy. And here I'm distinguishing agency from autonomy. So if agency is the ability to act, autonomy is the ability to make decisions beyond an automated process, beyond a set process, often making decisions or acting in near or real time. And of course, robots and robotic systems are very often components in the types of cyber physical systems that characterize the fourth industrial revolution that Rama mentioned a bit earlier. And these are the focus of a lot of the work that we do in the School of Cybernetics at the ANU. And specifically, what we're interested in is establishing praxis, so a combination of both new knowledge and theory, as well as practice, making change in the world, in how we can safely, sustainably, and responsibly scale cyber physical systems. So whether we're considering autonomous vehicles or drones or home assistants or smart buildings or other types of robotic systems and cyber physical systems, we are always recognizing that these objects that we experience as things and that we think of or imagine as acting and deciding are not the entire story, that these are really one subcomponent of much larger engineered systems. And we are interested in how we scale the entirety of those systems and not just the robotic components that we see. So I've just named three terms, agency and autonomy and cyber physical systems, that might suggest that the ways that we think about robots and robotics are concerns of the 21st century, or at least the earliest, the last 101 years since the coining of the term robots, which was in Karl Kapok's RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. It was a science fiction play by a Czech playwright that made its debut in 1920 and was about a factory owner who engineers and mass produces synthetic workers. So one way of thinking about the origins of the concept of robots, or the word robot, is to think about synthetic workers. And I'd like to pause here and consider my earlier conjecture that to robot is human by considering agency and autonomy in a broader time frame than just the last 101 years. And there's two historic threads that I want to pick apart a little bit as we start our framing of the why humans engage with robotics. And the first one is to realize that imagining robots is deeply human. And the second one is around understanding robots in the history of the creation of tools. Humans, we used to think were unique in making tools. We've kind of revised that idea of humans as tool-making animals. Lots of other animals make tools. But we are a bit unique in the creation of tools to extend and replace our own labor and other biological beings' labor. But also, I want to harken back to the idea of robot, the word robot, and its derivation from the Czech word for forced labor, and what that may mean for how we imagine and think about robotic systems today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The first thing that I said was that imagining robots is deeply human. There is a very long history of people around the world imagining robots and writing about robots, and robots featuring, and robot-like creatures featuring in myth and in storytelling and in actual engineering practices over the last 1,000 years at least. There's an excellent book by Adrian Mayor, M-A-Y-O-R, who was at Stanford University, called Gods and Robots, that I highly recommend. And in it, she talks about robots being a form of artificial life. And I really like this concept of thinking about robots not just as mechanical engineered systems that we think about today in the 21st century, but other descriptions of life that is artificial, or life that is made by human beings and not life that is born in some way. And we find all sorts of imagining of beings that are created by humans that are self-moving and that have agency and are often matching or surpassing the performance of humans. So one example that we might take is from ancient Greek mythology, and one of the first references to a robot, of course, is the story of Talos, a giant bronze robot that guarded Crete. And it guarded Crete from enemies of the first king, Minos. And it was made by Hephaestus, who was the god of basically ironworks and metalworks and invention and engineering, and of course commissioned by Minos's father, Zeus. So what's so interesting about this story is that it's a giant bronze guard that runs around the island. Maybe it doesn't quite run, but it goes around the island, it hurls rocks, it defends the borders of the island from invasion. And of course, it's taken down in the end by Medea by the removal of one single bolt that kind of makes the whole robot fall apart. But one of the most fascinating aspects of the Talos story, of course, is that it inflicts death upon humans by hugging them, by embracing them and being very hot and basically burning and melting them, which I think is this really fascinating idea of something that is both made by humans or made by, in this case, by a god, but is created, not born. And that does this interesting twist on the things that make us human and making them dangerous. I want to also mention one of the other stories in Mare's book, and that is about, and I'm about to apologize for my pronunciation, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And Rama, you should feel free to jump in and correct me. This is one of the stories about King Ajasatru. Yes.
Ajasatru.
Ajasatru. Of in 460 before the Common Era in the capital of Pataliputra in Northeast India. The story goes that he's a devotee of Buddha. And after Buddha's death, he kept the ashes and bones of the Buddha in an underground chamber that was guarded by automaton warriors that featured whirling blades. So, but not only did they have chariots that were automated, but they also themselves had whirling blades. And they stood on guard for over 200 years until King Ashoka fulfilled a prophecy to both disable them and distribute relics of Buddha in shrines across his realm. There's, of course, a whole series of stories that also go around this with basically an early engineer who had heard of the robots, of the artificial people that were being created in Rome to the west, and went there and was reincarnated there, married the daughter of the head robotics maker in Rome, stole the ideas, the plans for robotics, saved it inside his body in a, you can't see what I'm doing, in a cut in his thigh, and to bring it back to his hometown. And of course, didn't make it along the way, but made sure that his son brought his body home and was able to recreate the robots. So these stories we find all around the world. We also find stories of golems in the Jewish tradition. There's, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the stories that we tell about misunderstood human-made robots or human-made beings, and also a second historical trajectory with human-made robots and machines. And these are, of course, the stories of the automata. And so these go to the Middle Ages, strong history of it in the Middle East, as well as in other parts of the world. And one of the most famous ones that I think comes up quite a bit, and you may have heard about, of course, is a bit later, and it is the digesting duck in France in 1739 that was made to look as if it could operate by itself, a self-operating machine that ingested grain, digested it, and then defecated the after effects of the digestion. And we see these automata over time through the 18th and 19th and 20th century. And what I want to point out here is that we can get excited about robots and the types of advances that have made in robotics in the 20th and 21st centuries. And in some ways, the what of robotics, so imagining human-made beings that have agency, well predates our current practices and well predates Rossum's universal robots. But it's really the how and our abilities to create components now that are quite different, but that impulse isn't new. The second, if you go to the next slide, please. The second thread, historical thread I want to pull on a little bit, of course, is around automation and autonomy. In this case, we need to think about robots as in the broader history of engineering of tools to replace human and other labor. So we can think about the history of manufacturing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and processes for manufacturing that, again, Rama mentioned earlier in the first and second industrial revolutions that came with the idea of changing human labor or the development of systems for scientific management by Frederick Taylor. So this idea that we could break down complex tasks into routine smaller ones and optimize for performance over longer periods of time. So there's this, if you haven't read Frederick Taylor yet, I do recommend it. He has a whole analysis of giving men, of course they were men, the right size shovels for moving coal to be efficient over long periods of time, that you didn't want to have too small a shovel because you couldn't move enough, or too large a shovel because you get too tired over time. And what he was doing was thinking about creating consistent performance over an entire shift or across multiple shifts. And this idea of breaking tasks into smaller components that you could then replicate, of course, eventually leads to the creation of systems of machines to perform repetitive tasks and mechanical tasks, and eventually sensing, inferring, and acting sequences. And these are things that we may think, yeah, Taylorism, and we need to break things into tasks, and there's always this, can a human or a machine do something better? And the disconnect between the types of metrics that we use to understand robots versus the one that we use to understand human labor. And I'll point out just a short story of doing some work last year in mining industry in Australia, and thinking about what happens when you introduce automated trucks into open pit mining, and hearing the stories of the differences between the human truck drivers that would want to prove that they could be just as efficient as the trucks. And they could, of course, be just as efficient over a shorter period of time, or the time period of a shift or two shifts. But the metrics that are being used to judge the performance of basically the robots, the autonomous load and haul trucks, are of course very different than used for humans. And so when you measure over a longer time scale, the robots are going to eventually do better. And so again, what I want to point out here is the desire to create tools to extend or replace human labor and act with kind of perfect knowledge and predictably and without fatigue to increase productivity and safety has quite a long history. It's well established. But again, what's happening now in 2021 is really what's new. And one more point I want to make, or a different way of thinking about robotics and humans' relationship to robotics. I wanted to go to the next slide, please. And my last take on thinking about the history of robotics is to talk a little bit about cybernetics, which you have to imagine that I will do since that's where I'm based at the moment. And here I'm really thinking about cybernetics of the mid-20th century that we might think of as the experimental or the hobbyist or the playful side of thinking about other futures for automation and for automata, and for creating systems that have agency, and agency in that through small sets of rules can demonstrate some aspects of autonomous decision making. So I'm going to plant that seed here, and I'll return to a little bit later, that our current age of robotics we can trace to the middle of the last century and the development of approaches to information theory and artificial intelligence in the 1940s. And the early cyberneticians, of course, focused on systems and on information and communication and control. They thought about the goals of a system rather than necessarily all the steps, and on information and on flows of information to steer systems towards a particular goal. And one of the most famous of these experiments was, of course, the neuroscientist Gray Walter's tortoises that you're seeing here, Elsie and Elmer, which he described as being part of a new species called Machina speculatrix. So speculative in organic species. And he built these in his home in 1948. It's a kind of a little side hustle, side hobby. And they're small electromechanical robots with wheels that have like 2 wheels at the back, a wheel at the front, and a fork. And they had a photocell mounted at the front that would search out for light, sources of light, and move towards it until that source of light got too intense. And then the rotation of the wheels would shift and the tortoise would move away. So they just kind of like went in these crazy circles looking for light and not looking for light. And they had simple contact sensors. So that would stop the robot, stop the tortoises when they reached a wall or sometimes, you can't see me touching the wall, it's a wall here, touching a wall. And they would kind of basically move back and forth until they moved themselves out again. He also put lights on the top of them that were mainly at first to show that if the light was on, it was in sensing mode and it was looking for light. And if it found a light and it had, latched onto it, the light would go off. So, it was no longer in searching mode. Now, of course, this meant if you got Elsie and Elmer together and their lights were pointing towards each other, they would start acting in ways that Gray Walter had not anticipated. And he called this a little bit of a dating ritual where they would try to get close to each other and then stop and move apart and then try to get close to another and stop and move apart. And he talked a little bit about their unrequited desire for each other. And it also created really weird behaviors around mirrors. So the tortoise would get close to a mirror, which I think he's probably showing with that shiny fireplace. And it would get enamored with itself, see the light, latch onto it, turn off, get too intense, turn off, turn on, turn off, turn off. And it would just basically vibrate and jiggle in front of the mirror until it could be moved off. And there's something just kind of delightful about thinking about a tortoise as the type of robotic system that we should be thinking about and the types of feedback inherent in it. And of course, it has links to later robotics work, including that of the Brooks lab with the Allen robot in the 1980s and the growth again of an interest in biological robots. And so I find a little bit of inspiration in thinking about cybernetics and robotics, particularly second order cybernetics of Gregory Bateson, a fellow anthropologist, and others who are thinking about our relationship in systems with robotics, not just what the robots are doing, but how we are relating to them. And with that, I wanted to hand off to Jagannath to do the next bit on the present of robotics, particularly in India and the US, I think.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Jagannath Raju. I'm the founder of Cybernetics, which is a robotics company in Bengaluru. And this is going to be a very sharp transition from the social space to the nerd space. And mainly because I've been in the field now for 30 plus, maybe even 40 years. Started off even before the word robotics was either a terminology used in industry or in coursework. There was no academic work in robotics at that time, which sort of tells you that robotics is really an amalgamation of a lot of different engineering disciplines. So the fact that we were doing work which now could be called robotics, but we were actually doing it because it involved mechanical, electrical knowledge of, at one time there was no software, it was just analog electronics. So before I step into my slides, I wanted to make a few introductory comments on it. I've kept my slides very uncluttered, no text, hoping that you will listen to me rather than read what's on the slide. A lot of it, since they're images and content which have been taken from the internet, anybody interested in the credits or anything else, I can share that separately. I didn't want to, again, clutter the slide with the credit for each of those images. The field is so large and it continues to expand. Siddharth, can you hold on for one more minute? Okay, thanks. I will tell you when to stop. And it continues to expand into areas that I don't think we can even comprehend yet, because till we realize the potential to impact humanity, we really won't know what else can be done with it. So what I will be offering is actually a very small sample. And the small sample is to accommodate both time constraints and also what I have been exposed to, which is part of it only, or aware of. And the challenge to frame these as past, present, and future is also a bit subjective. So I just wanted to tell you what I mean by that. Because past is not necessarily that, some technology has become obsolete. It may be that, it is something that could not find enough roots to make a difference. Or it may be something so mature that anything evolving out of that is very incremental. So it almost is not changing much, which I consider to be the past, even if it may be still used in the present. And present would be what is in widespread use right now. I mean, everybody is using it, and there are advances happening in it, where it's getting faster, smarter, or anything else that lends itself to real-world applications. Future could be current technology, which is, not yet gained full acceptance, or we still don't know whether it is viable. And we don't know what new domains it can be brought into. It can be present technology, but we still don't know how it can actually be used in many scenarios. And as Alex mentioned, you will see an underlying pattern in this. Underlying pattern is, it's an evolution from automation in very structured environments, which was easy enough to do, which is going towards autonomy in unstructured environments, where you need additional senses and additional capabilities to be able to handle unexpected scenarios. So that is the underlying pattern you will see as the slides start. In terms of geographical context, mainly it's going to be global. I will dwell a bit on the Indian context, and I have consciously chosen applications in agriculture to focus on in the Indian context, because all the other cases, our use in India just mirrors what is done abroad, but just on a smaller scale. So, it doesn't make any sense to really do that on the industrial level. But I think our agricultural space is quite different from what you will see globally, and that's where it makes some sense. So starting with the first slide, I think the credit for the first really what you could call a robot, I mean, now you could call it a robot, is what is the most dexterous limb that we have is an arm. And there was a group called Central Research Labs in 1949, formed by a team of 3 people who built these master slave manipulators to handle radioactive fuel. So the left side of this robotic arm is the master, which a person is handling in a very safe area. And all the transmission happens through that through tube that you see to the right side, which is handling the radioactive fuel. So this was a way of protecting people from the radioactive impact of handling radioactive fuel. And it was purely mechanical. There were cables going through from one side to the other side. And one would be surprised that even with cables, you could get a sense of touch. If you actually went and gripped something there, you would feel it on your side that you had gripped something. It all depended on the stiffness of the transmission, and it was pretty good. The picture below that is a much more advanced one, which is electrical master slave, which uses servos. And if you notice a huge rack in the background, that's all analog electronics. And that's the size of the rack that was used to drive these 2 manipulator arms. So you can see the advances since 1949 to now, where the entire rack would probably be on a couple of power MOSFETs that you would have now in industry. The first industrial application, the first, I would say, widespread use of industrial robotic arms was actually a design done by Vic Scheinman, who was an MIT undergrad and then a Stanford grad. And he built this arm, which was called a Puma arm, which was built with the collaboration of Unimation, which was the first robotics company, working with GM and using this for automotive applications. And that's what really started the widespread use of industrial robotic arms. After that, GM did a collaboration with Fanuc of Japan. And so GM Fanuc was born. And I think Fanuc is now probably the largest and most, with the largest portfolio of robotic arms, which you see on the bottom line there. That probably doesn't capture all the Fanuc's arms, but that's what happened. This company that was started, Unimation, and it's, a lot of these innovations happened in the US. I show another small robot arm there, which is a parallel link arm. And the reason I mentioned that, it was also developed by a US company called Adept and is now owned by Omron. So all these innovations finally shifted where Japan now has a very dominant position in industrial robotics. There are multiple companies. The other companies you can think of outside Japan would be KUKA of Germany, which is now owned by a Chinese company, ABB in Sweden. And interestingly, Staubli, which is now, I think, a French company, but Unimation got sold to Westinghouse, and then Westinghouse was acquired by Staubli. So there is still one DNA roots back to the Puma robotic arm, which still exists, which is Staubli. So all this portfolio are there. The reason I have put all this in the past is the Fanuc arms now are a bit different than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I mean, they are maybe more lighter weight. They look more sleek. They use more modern components, but otherwise functionally they're almost the same, which is why I consider that in a sense to be the past. Next, Siddhant. I think the autonomous vehicle thing actually started with the DARPA challenge. It was around 2005 to 2007. And if you look at the image there, you can see how many sensors were on a vehicle for it to be able to try to complete the challenge. And this was a challenge where it had to complete the entire route. And I think it was somewhere in the western part of the US that they had the route. And you had to complete it without any manual intervention. And I think successfully done in 2006, and then multiple teams completed in 2007. Then there is the Boston Dynamics Big Dog, which is viral on the internet. Everybody probably has seen videos of it. Again, I put it in the past because there are different versions of it. Now it was built for defense applications. And as far as I know, it's a shelf project at this point, but it was the beginnings of legged locomotion of the kind that you see there. It's completely integrated. There are no tethers anywhere. It carries its own power source. The other one below that is, again, iRobot, it's a PackBot, dated around 1998. iRobot sold their entire military division in 2016. I think somebody else does still sell and market it, but there's not too much. There are many other things that have come up for bomb disposal and stuff. Big Dog, I think, has transferred to other variants, and they're looking to see whether you can use it in civilian use. But again, these also I've put down in the past because they are just things that are not in widespread use anymore. Next, Siddhant. And I'm just going to go off track a bit and talk about Hollywood, which a lot of people first idea of what robotics could be from a Hollywood perspective. I'm not sure if there's anybody in the audience who would remember the movie Jaws, unless you are my age. And Jaws was very interesting because what they used for the filming was actually a mechanical shark, which had all the movements and everything inside. And that picture I selected was one which shows how much, how many mechanisms were inside to be able to pull off very natural motions that a shark would have. And it was used extensively. I think they built 3 or 4 of them for the filming. And it's probably still there in Universal City if people go and visit. The one which had more appeal was probably Terminator, because it went through a whole series of them. And Terminator, you can see how highly detailed the number of, it's really the beginning of animatronics, where it may not have been autonomous, it still was choreographed, but the kind of mechanisms and all that they could put together so that it was realistic, where the eyes would probably blink and they would glance sideways and all that kind of stuff. And I believe right now it is up for auction somewhere, this prototype that was built. And I've not checked who bought it, but it's available for enthusiasts who want to see what was used in that movie. Some people may ask me, what about Star Wars? Because Star Wars had two characters called C3PO and R2D2. And the reason I've not chosen to put them is C3PO was really a human in a robot suit. So it was just a masquerade in a sense. And R2D2 was, I would say, a bit uncharitably called a trash can on wheels at that time, because it looked like a garbage can and they had wheels on it. But it really elicited a lot of response from moviegoers who said, in the future, maybe there'll be robots like this. And so there has been an impact from Hollywood. And I think that impact from Hollywood actually grows further as their capabilities. But a lot of it has now shifted to simulation and computer graphics than actually building these prototypes. So that's the transition that has happened, which is why this is again in the past. Next one, Siddhant. This, I had a question mark when I put in the past. So I'm now going to a small a context which is Indian. And I have actually been involved in some of this. The coconut harvesting has always been a profession in the southern part of India. So families actually taught their kids how to do it so they could continue the family profession. And of course, with migration and all, there are very few people left in the southern state of Kerala who are willing now to climb trees to harvest coconuts. So the Kerala government has been looking for many, many years, at least 10, 15 years. When they first talked to me, it was almost 15 years ago. And they've been trying to build these solutions. And what you see on the left is actually a wheeled vehicle going up. And the question, first of all, is the reason I put these two things, so the wheeled vehicles, for people who would have done the analysis of this, coming from an academic background, you will understand that the minute you do a wheeled vehicle and you try to grip harder, then you would need more torque. And the minute you need more torque, you need a bigger motor, which makes it heavier, in which case, so I've never seen one of these work successfully, right? But people have persisted with it. Then I came across a second one, which is shown on the right-hand side, which is built by a team out of VIT Vellore, which from an academic sense, and there's actually an academic paper published on it, which is the right way to do it. If you look at step 1, step 2, step 3, that's how the climbers who climb trees do it. They keep their feet at the lower point, then take their hands up to the higher point, and then they keep just doing this motion as they go up. I've not seen it yet whether it's been commercialized, but I think the approach is right, and it has commercial potential if somebody were to be able to take it. The reason I hesitate about the past is if we don't do that, it will become something of the past, but it can be something that can become the present in the future if there is some kind of a support system that can actually realize this, because I think it's reached the point where people from academia who can do the analysis from a thing could work with people who can build these things and take it to market. Our Department of Atomic Energy has actually, both BARC and Kalpakam, have developed a lot of those master slave manipulators that I showed you. And they've been using it in India. So that's one sphere where India is self-sufficient. And they had to do it, of course, because there were export restrictions from countries abroad and then sanctions after a while. Indian industrial robotics, the adoption is not very high compared to global levels. Primarily, auto companies use them for welding and painting, and affordability has been the main issue. Only big companies could afford it. So it's on a much smaller scale. If what goes on abroad goes on in India, you will see industrial robotics on the shop floor, but mainly for welding and painting. So from here, Siddhant, can you go next, please? So I'm moving to the present. Next. So what has happened in the industrial robotics space? As I said, no, all of them have been conventional robots or robotic arms. The new buzzword in robotic arms is something called a collaborative robotic arm, or cobot for short. And this was something that was pioneered by Universal Robots of Denmark around the mid 2000s. Universal is now owned by Teradyne of the US. So they're acquired by Teradyne about 5-6 years back. And what one means by collaboration is what you see in the picture below. That a human would work next to the robot without feeling any sense of danger that the robot would collide and injure the person. And so the human is doing a task, I think, that probably is much more difficult for the robot to do. And the robot is doing the task that's much easier for the robot, very repetitive task. It just brings it to the person takes over and does something else, etc. This is the first level of collaboration that people are thinking of, where you prevent any kind of serious injury. Collision still happens when it happens, but the collaborative robotic arms are designed to sense the collision and drain all the energy out of the system so that you don't injure the person. As we move to the next level, people will come up with sensing systems that will sense. I mean, they're already there, but they have not been built into the system yet because it requires integration in many sources. That will be the next level of collaboration, where they will know each other's presence and they won't collide, right? The robot will take evasive action if it senses that there's a person in the way, and then will work out a new path autonomously, saying, oh, I need to go around because this person's hand is in the way. So there are many manufacturers of cobots now. Since 2005, every major company in the world is now producing collaborative robots. And its use has spread like wildfire. It's no longer used only in industrial uses. Now people use it for flipping burgers. They flip it for putting toppings on pizzas. And it's only one's imagination constraint that would keep you from doing whatever you want with it. So this is what is going to be growing at a maybe 50% growth rate year on year for the next few years, and is the really hot space in the industrial, in the robotic arm space. The other thing that one sees in the medical space is, and it's this company, Intuitive Surgical, which manufactures the Da Vinci surgical robot, completely dominates the space right now. It offers the surgeon a way to first practice the surgery. So it's a very interactive system. So there is still a human component to it. The surgeon is really practicing how he or she would actually first, do the incisions and how it would look like and what they would. There's a sense of haptics also built in so that they actually can sense the tissue sometimes. I'm not sure how sophisticated it is yet because I've not used any of these. And the basic idea is to eliminate the tremor from the surgeon's hands so that the incision is very precise. And the use case is that if you do very precise incisions, both post-operative care and recovery would be much lower. And these are things that I think India has an installed base of some 50 of these units and probably growing every quarter more and more. Affordability is again the issue because each of these robots probably costs in excess of 20 crores, which means, anybody going in for surgery would probably pay more than $1 lakh to be able to use this. And consumables also are very expensive on this. But this is the present in the medical sphere. It's very widespread. It's used worldwide. Siddhant, next slide, please. Another space which is actually booming is e-commerce. And e-commerce means everything that you buy is in a warehouse, hopefully close by, so they can ship it to you in a day. If it's not, they send it from other places. There is no way that with the current e-commerce range of sales and all that, this could be done humanly. So you will see a whole bunch of mobile platforms running all over the floor, carrying pallets from one place to another. Everything is integrated. The first company that did this was Kiva Robotics in Boston, which was acquired by Amazon. It's now Amazon Robotics. It's graduating to the picture that you see below that, where now they're starting to put robotic arms onto the vehicles so that not only can it run around, it can also pick out stuff from shelves. Not that prevalent yet, but I think it will slowly pick up as more and more, the need arises for it. It's much more expensive than just having that mobile platform. So there will be, cost issues related to that. That's in warehouses. In homes, iRobot's Roomba has been around for, I don't know, 20 years now. It's, again, a company that came out of the Boston ecosystem, robotics ecosystem. I never felt really that it would have much of a market in India, given the kind of environments we have. But you would be surprised when the pandemic happened, all the iRobot models in India went out of stock. And you had to wait, or you had to find somebody that you knew in iRobot to give a call and say, so people called me up and said, do you know anybody in iRobot? And I said, I do know people in iRobot, but I don't think that will solve any problems. You got to learn how to sweep and don't wait for the Roomba to show up. The interesting part is that it has evolved to be able to handle the kind of, the types of dirt that we have and the kind of environments that we have, the kind of floors that we have. It's pretty effective. It's effective enough that people are paying the price point for it and buying it. So it shows that people will, that the robotics can adapt to different global situations. And the pandemic has actually triggered a lot of interest in these kind of systems that people were looking for, which would do your work for you. Now, I guess when people go back to work and no longer work from home, they will really figure out whether they still want to keep these things or whether it will go on to a new thing after that. But iRobot has lots of market in India, a lot of showrooms, and they're really growing in India now. Next, please, Siddhant. This is the one I wanted to show up. I was debating whether to put it in present or past, and I'll tell you why. So this is a very ambitious effort by SoftBank to create the first humanoid, human-looking, I wouldn't say humanoid, human-looking robot that people would be comfortable to interact with. The whole idea was, could you use this? So a lot of banks bought this Pepper to put in their reception and handle customer service at the earliest level, like, may I show you somewhere? Do you have a question? And IBM partnered with SoftBank and connected it in the cloud with IBM Watson. So in real time, you were having IBM Watson handle queries, figure out responses, and send it back. Right? So this is something that was very aspirational during the pandemic. The third picture I have at the bottom, I guess the unemployment hit Pepper also. So because they could get this whole huge squad of Peppers to cheer at a baseball game. So they just lined them up in the seats because there were no fans and got them to cheer. This is the last that I heard is that this actually Pepper is being, sort of put in the background. They will go on to other things. They've stopped production of Pepper now. And I think some of the places where it was overreaching, it was one of the early settlers in this space and couldn't handle the expectations that got set up. And that's one thing that you will find, that expectations are very high when you build anything which says that you can handle human interaction, right? They expect it to be human interaction, and anything that's even slightly off the thing will be jarring for people. So that's one of the things that has come out from this, but I think this will be the platform for people to build future ones, which will actually handle maybe human interaction, even more sophisticated human interaction. And the next one, Siddhant. So I was looking for something for the present in the agricultural space for India. And there have been multiple drones companies in India. The first one was Idea Forge, which is already probably more than 10 years old. A lot of the problems really have been, there have been regulatory problems. Can you legally fly one of these things? But one of the things that I have seen that people are picking up and is actually a use case that makes sense is spraying insecticide or pesticide or nutricide, whichever way you want to call it, and seeds and stuff like that. This is a very, very effective one, which is currently can be used. There's nothing preventing you except probably regulation to use this. And I'm not sure to what extent this is now prevalent, but if you look at agricultural use of drones, this is the most obvious and the most that it can scale up very, very quickly. And I will talk about other things for agricultural space in the next one. So this is a brief thing about where I think we are. And as I said, it's a very small sample. So before, I think the future for robotics is actually still going to be driven from the non-nerd side. It's going to be something that will be a cultural imperative or a social imperative or something that's part of a strategic way to do things. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Alex to sort of talk about that so that then we can see, once we get seeded with various ideas from that space, what is it that we can do with all the technology that we have so far put together to be able to realize what the expectations are for the future.
Thank you, Dr. Raju. Before we go to the questions, could I just request if we could answer a few questions that the audience members had asked?
Sure.
So Ojasvi, if you're there, request you to please ask your question.
Hi, Siddhant. Hi, Alex and Jagannath. Thank you for such a lovely landscape version of how humans and robots have been coexisting and developing so far. I actually have been studying a little about affective computing, so the space of emotions and AI. And I was wondering and this is open to the whole panel, what are your thoughts on the current approaches of adding emotional intelligence to machines or robots, especially in context to the synthesis and expression of emotions by machines? Again, if you guys have any recommendations for me of things that I could read up on and learn from, that would be awesome. I would love that. And the reason I asked this question is because I'm reading this book called Affective Computing by Professor Rosalind Pickard. And what she mentioned at that time was, it's about a 20-year-old book, but what it mentioned there was the process of not just understanding how humans are emoting, but also machines, emoting and like having their own language in a sense of speaking. And I wanted to know, given that we as humans learn over years as we grow how to, understand and identify what an emotion is, how do you think something like that will happen in machines, and what does it mean to you guys?
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question. Affective computing, you're right, Roz Pickard is the person that you should be starting with, most definitely. I think I tend to think about emotion and affect as two sides of the same coin, or that they're not quite the same thing. And affect being kind of the expression of some type of inner state, but it's behavioral, whereas emotion is cultural and psychological. And some of the things that I think are the challenges there are understanding the differences between behaviors that are expressions of affect and how they could be reread in different parts of the world, but also why we desire to have that type of relationship with the robotic systems that we're building. So in the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about that relational aspect, and it's that bit the interest in affect there that I think is most telling about us as much as it is about the machines that we create.
From my own recollection, I remember Sony built a small dog called Aibo, which sold very well and sort of was trying to mimic the way you would play with a dog, right? It would roll over if you touched it or you tickled it and stuff like that. Emotional intelligence, I suspect, is much more difficult to understand, comprehend, and all than even the, what would say, the artificial intelligence or logical kind of intelligence people talk about is, I would have absolutely no clue to what it would involve in terms of analysis or anything else. But the small things like, when we were trying to build animatronic dolls or something, it was very clear that, unless you made the eyelids blink, it would not look human. And if you're standing in front of it, right, you would know that it's a robot. But the minute you made a small thing like eyelids blink, it changed the whole interaction and stuff. So I think to be able to build emotions into expressions that people could identify, it will take a lot of advances in how you actually, the agency as you talk about, how you actually be able to realize these things. So people are building, just the mouth expression or the way the, your face contorts to be able to, show anger or anything else. So that it's quite a bit of work. And I'm not very much in it, so I would not be able to comment on that. But I sense from a technological perspective, it is quite far off at this point. Till we actually understand what we want to do, then we work about how to do the agency part of it.
Thank you both. And then perhaps we can ask one more question. We can have one more question before we continue with the rest of our talk, and then we'll have a Q&A, session at the end as well. So Vansh, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, sir. Sir, so most of the work which I saw in India was related to manufacturing robotics specifically, and even the company Systematics, I don't really remember the name of the company, but I mean, specifically, I have visited your site like twice or thrice before I joined the session. I saw the kind of work you are doing. So it was related to manipulators, if I'm correct. So like most of the work is going into manipulators and then manufacturing robots, just like you showed in Amazon Robotics. So, sir, what I wanted to ask was like, how can we start basically working on other aspects of robotics, which are more like deep into research kind. So like we have Atlas, Boston Dynamics, and then we have other things like soft robotics, etc., etc. So how can we actually just dive into them, and how can we start working on them in India? If we see US, we have 2 to 3 companies who are working in bipedal robotics. Boston Dynamics is there, Ghost Robotics is there. So
let me take 2 parts of it. One, I will defer because at the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a bit about why these things are not happening in India, right? So that will happen. And the first part of it is, why are we building industrial robotic arms? Because as a commercial company, right, we have to pay the bills. So we have to be where the market is and where there is a customer. So customers, we have to be in a mature space where people say, okay, we understand the use of this robotics. We have a return on investment on buying an industrial robotic arm. The real question to be asked is that, why are we the only company building industrial robotic arms? Because everybody else is, all the other robotic arms are imported still in India, right? And I wouldn't even say we still don't have a product in a state where we would say we are competing with them, but at least we are close. But there should have been 20 other companies doing this by now, given a mature thing. And that is the same reason why when I talk about policy making and all the infrastructure and all, you will realize that we are not into any of the things yet, which don't have a sufficient market in India, but still have to be promoted if you want to get there at some point. So wait till the end, and that second part of the question will get answered.
Sorry, Professor, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I thought I had unmuted and I had muted again. I wanted to take over again and just talk very briefly about thinking about robotic systems and robotic relationships. There were so many excellent examples in the previous section that I want to build on that just a little bit. And if you go to the next slide, please. What I want to point out here is, it's a point I made a little bit earlier, but that was very, very clear in all of the examples that we just heard, is that when we're talking about robotics, we tend to focus on the figure and not the ground, right? The figure here being this goblet-shaped vessel, which is, supposed to represent the robot itself. But we also need to be thinking about the ground. We need to be thinking about everything that's surrounding that. In this case, you're seeing outlines of people, but also the other systems that make that robot run. We talked a little bit about that as being constrained environments and trying to move from constrained environments to more open environments to have more advanced sensing and inference and acting to be able to do that. But the point that I want to make here is that when we're thinking about the exciting things that we can do with robots and robotics, we need to be thinking about how those systems are going to scale and what are all the contingencies and all of the other subsystems that they depend on. So it's not just, can I build this robotic arm for manufacturing, but it's also the things that Jackie was talking about earlier around what is the ecosystem, why is there not more competition, what are the policies around there. You have to think about the communications infrastructure, you have to think about all sorts of supply chain things. And to focus just on the figure is not really what's most interesting and not really what's going to get us very far in the future when we think about how these systems are going to scale. So while it's exciting to think a little bit about the interaction between robots and humans, we also have to be thinking not just that kind of tip of the iceberg, but everything behind it. So if you go to the next slide, we've talked a little bit about robotic vacuums. And what I think was really interesting here was some of the examples given earlier around where a lot of robotics research has come out of, particularly DARPA in the US, and some of the earlier versions of the robotic vacuums being found in military applications around mine sweeping, etc. But also harkening back to what are the stories that we tell ourselves around robotics and what robotics are for. And I'll go back to the story at the very beginning around Talos, and the things that we're doing are creating artificial life to do the work of warfare often, or also the work that we do not want to be doing ourselves. But again, when I look at these types of systems, and when I look also at the other example that I thought was so good, and now I'm trying to remember which one it was, because I wrote it down. I think I'll just stick with this one. This robotic vacuum cleaners are sensing the environment, and they are, picking up dirt, etc. But the advanced ones, of course, are dependent on creating maps of the space, and that these maps are then one of the byproducts of the running of the robotic object, and that have value in themselves. And so in the US, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, there are debates around who owns that data and what's being done with it, and all sorts of things around privacy that you might not think that you need to think about when you're just thinking about, is it picking up the dirt from my flooring? And so that's useful to think about, that robot isn't just in your house. It is in lots of other places because of the infrastructure that's necessary to make it run. And the second point I wanted to make on the next slide, which came out really clearly in a lot of the examples about the past and present of robotics, on the next slide, please, are the ways that we think about and we imagine the relationships that we are modeling into our creations and to our intended and our expected behavior and interactions. So hopefully the next slide will come up soon. And what you'll see is a few, there you go, silly little icons. But what I wanted to point out here is that we have models of the world that we then think about in the relationships that we have with robotics. So I find it really fascinating that the language that was used in robotics in 1949 with the original robotic arms, that you could feel things right through the robotic arms that were checking on nuclear materials, is the language around master and slave, which as a social scientist, like, completely gets my hackles up. But it's interesting because it is saying the relationship is one of complete control, and that it is a closed system that you can completely control everything that's going on. Also harkens back to robot as enforced labor or forced labor, etc. And the shift to thinking about things like cobots or collaboration, or thinking about the Boston Dynamics as like slightly dog-like, and what type of interactions do we expect from a dog and how do we expect it to act, or thinking about robots that may be more like cats or like babies that need to learn over time, or like Gray Walter's tortoises, or that are basically taking the shape of cars or shape of vehicles, but if they are autonomously driving systems, right? And it's the act of driving that's made autonomous, not the car itself. But we still project the idea that this thing that we're looking at isn't a complex, highly distributed system, but rather a car, or looking at advanced manufacturing. And the point I want to make here is that the language that we use and the way that we think about robots and our relationship to them really matters. I did a study a few years ago looking at smart home applications and the idea of artificial intelligence in the home and what people would want it to do, particularly around applications that might have robotic components. I had product managers who said, just give me the KPIs. What are the KPIs for making these products work? And I was like, there is no product. I cannot give you a key performance indicator if there's no product. But what I can tell you is expectations that people have for how they expect these types of devices would work in the home, based on the scenarios they said would matter to them. And I gave people a series of 4 ways that they could imagine an AI-enabled smart home or robotic home, or components of a smart home could work. And they were as follows. Would you expect the performance of the device that you've imagined to be like a puppy? Does it need to be trained over time? That you would take the time to help it learn? That it might, like a puppy, have an accident in the house every once in a while, do something wrong, but eventually get better over time? Would you expect it to perform like a flaky friend? Somebody that you can't really count on, nice to have around in good times, but if there's really an emergency, that's not the device or the person that you would count on? Would you think about it like a long-term partner? Someone who does not always do the dishes or the task that you've asked in the way that you would prefer and that you would find to be the right way, but is good enough and you understand what their quirks are and you work around it? Or would you consider it that it would need to act like your first love, that it would have to be kind of perfect in every way, and the moment that it wasn't perfect and it broke your heart would be broken forever and you would not trust it anymore? And the interesting thing we found was that for the most part, nobody really expected this idea of perfection out of the robotics in the home. That they were fine with it being more like a long-term partner, and they thought of things like electricity and internet service in their home as acting in this way, and they kind of would put up with it, and they would expect robots to act the same way or behave the same way. But mostly people thought of them as puppies, that these were systems that would require some adjusting and some work over time to work well with them and to work over time. And so I just want us to think for a moment about what are the metaphors and what are the expectations for the relationships that we have with these systems. And to the question earlier about affect, do we expect affect in these systems and expect affect in our relationships with them? And if they don't display that affect, will they still work as we expect? And with that, I wanted to turn a little bit to the future of robotics, and I will hand off again to hear a little bit about that, and I'll have a few very short closing comments after that. So I think we probably go to the next slide.
Okay. You will notice that I've not put timelines on these. I couldn't locate the right astrological charts for it yet. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these are already in pilot. This is one of the big things abroad, that you will do delivery. It could be bipeds, it could be drones, it could be multi-legged, it could be wheeled vehicles, it could be lots of many things. Some of these are already being tested out. There is one company, the commercial viability is, I would say, yet to be established completely. And there was a company that was actually delivering pizzas in California that were not only delivered with the van, but the robotic arms were in the van baking the pizzas. So that as soon as it reached the doorstep, it came from the oven and was put in your hands, basically. And it was a great idea, but didn't pan out finally, and I think they closed down. So this is something that I think slowly will work out. A lot of it will have to do with regulatory practices. I don't see any of this happening in India at this point. Basically, autonomous vehicles, we are still a long way to have stuff to do that. The drones part, I think in India is being used for delivering medical supplies kind of stuff. That's being explored. Otherwise, the rest of it is still something that will stay abroad for quite some time. But delivery is definitely a big space for the future for people building robotic systems. Next slide, Siddhant. And as someone mentioned, Boston Dynamics Atlas. The reason I put it in the future is there has been an Atlas earlier, but it was very primitive compared to what is available now. It can do a tango, it can do all kinds of dancing. There are viral videos about it. So this is definitely what will be in the future. What kind of applications will be suitable for it? People will figure it out. The same thing for, a big dog has basically streamlined, looks more, I wouldn't say like a dog, but at least the sense that it is trotting like a dog more in a sense. So Spot is there. Atlas was used extensively by the DARPA challenge people about 5-6 years ago. So they got a lot of feedback from that to be able to take it to the next level, where now it starts to do things like, you can just see the videos online. It shows the extent to which it has become really agile and dexterous and stuff. The other Android in the future is the NASA one, which has been built for space. And like anything else, a lot of the technology that has gone into the Valkyrie will slowly trickle down into a lot of other civilian and use at a more affordable thing. So that's really what happens with a lot of these projects, that they all end up. Next, please. This is something really, I don't think too many people know about it, but there's a German company that called Festo, which was in the pneumatic space. They have been inspired to build bionic robots. Anybody who has not seen these, please go look at the videos. They have everything from spiders to butterflies to flying foxes, or they look like bats, elephant trunks. All these have been bio-inspired. And there was a mention about soft robotics. A lot of soft robotics is what Festo is working on. And this is one of the things that may not be immediate applications, but it will build technologies that will find uses as people realize what the potential of these things is, that these kind of things can be done, right? People will start working out how to leverage this. And the last slide I have on the future is, again, coming back to India. Again, I'm focusing on agriculture. Agriculture in India, farm labor is a very big problem because of migration. Tasks in the hot sun are very, very hard. Nobody really would want to do it in real life. And there's upward mobility of the next generation. They are not going to be sitting there in the village. They want to move. Upward mobility is there. They're all issues. So one of the things we can think of is, why not take technology back to the farms? So people who want to build all these things, they don't have to be in cities to develop this technology. They're developing technology that they can use directly. You will already see a lot of small farming moving into greenhouses or net houses. Net houses are a lighter version of a greenhouse. And farming there, because you don't have to suffer the vagaries of the weather, and you can really have very high, very efficient production. The potential to automate to a small extent, and then maybe some kind of autonomous work like sensing which fruit are now ripe and need to be picked, etc. So all things that have a large potential in India that people are already working on. The bottom right picture is a cotton picking robot done by a company called G-Robot Mac. Again, these are all small steps, because the real challenge in this technology is that the environment is very hostile, especially if you're outside. Everything that you build has to have ingress protection from rain, from dirt, from dust. All that takes the cost high. And then you have to figure out how to make it affordable. So keeping affordability aside, I don't think full autonomy is what is the target for these. I think these all semi-autonomous with some human intervention assistance is probably optimal in the Indian context, so that people are still engaged on doing something that utilizes their human skills of judgment and everything else, and let the robot do something which is monotonous, repetitive, and use some data out which one should be plucked, etc. Because it can use data from a vision system to say, yeah, this is ripe. You don't have to go look at it and figure out, we'll just pluck this kind of stuff. So having a focus on robotics is in the agriculture space is, I think, what the future is really for us, for something which is local context. All the other things will happen. We'll continue to mirror what's happening globally. There'll be some point where we'll maybe be using drones for delivery. Bipeds and quadrupeds, I'm still a bit pessimistic that they have a space. Wheeled vehicles, definitely. There are companies with vehicles for cargo transport, given that there are no humans, there are no people inside the vehicles, so the danger is mitigated to a certain extent. So this is what I wanted to look at in the Indian context. I am going to just take a few minutes and talk about what I said when there was a question about why are we not working on a lot of these things in India, right? What keeps us, well, it's happening in the US, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll touch upon a few things. I would like to say that there are many, many well-intentioned efforts. There are many that would like to see this happen. Yet the reality is it doesn't happen. Keep aside regulatory policies. For example, the drones companies in India are still not sure what the regulatory policies for drones are. There was policy which was published about a few years ago, maybe 2 years back. And they talked about that you would have to file a flight pack before you had the drone take off and do something above a certain size, etc., etc. So unless you have this infrastructure to be able for somebody to very easily adhere to those kind of regulations, it's not going to happen. Nobody will have the way to do that. So those regulatory things will still take some time. I don't think anybody at this point is talking about regulatory systems for autonomous vehicles as of yet now. The main thing is there support that will help doing a lot of the stuff that, whether it's building humanoid robots and all. US, China, and the European Union all have published roadmaps for robotics. They have published it. There was an effort in India. An Indian professor in the US got IEEE to work on this, and a whole bunch of us did volunteer to be on these committees, and we worked on it for a year. But nothing came of it finally, because at the end of the day, there has to be strong engagement, proactive engagement from the government. It cannot be something where it says, go do it, and then we'll look at it. Because a lot of people at the beginning will say, yeah, we'll do it, and then nothing happens to it. They'll never come back to the table again, saying we're not going to spend. We did spend almost a year trying to pull this roadmap for robotics. I chaired the manufacturing section. There was a group that looked at agriculture, group looked at medical. We looked at all the different things. But finally, we did not get a roadmap out of it because there was no confidence level that it would finally result in something. Because without engagement from the government, these roadmaps will not. If you look at the roadmaps of China, EU, and they have very, very deep engagement from the federal governments of all three places. That they have said, this is a roadmap, this is how we are going to support you, and this is what you can expect from us. At the end of the day, money is the thing that people need to do all this development. When you think of Boston Dynamics, iRobot, you think of the entire Boston ecosystem, including Kiva. I grew up as part of that. Every single one of those companies benefited from federal grants under a program called the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And just yesterday, I heard from a friend who was sharing with me the latest grant given to a small company in Boston to build a system using a robotic arm to assemble salads for the military. It would figure out, how many pieces of something to put and do it on a large scale. And they got a $100,000 grant under SBIR to just form their opinion, to come up with a concept, not even to do anything to build it, just to come up with a concept. That kind of system is the only system that will get people to build and develop these things. Because you realize none of these innovations happen in the large multinationals. They all happen in small companies. Some of them get acquired by large multinationals so that they can scale and grow. But the seed is always with small companies which have very passionate founders. There is no support from them in the Indian system. People are not looking for financial. The strategic investment must come from the government. Once you are able to prove something, the financial investors will be there. There will be VCs who will come in at that stage. But that earlier part must be strategic investment where the government says this is strategically important for our country. So we will make the initial strategic investment. That is not there. There's a trust deficit between private companies and the government. Until that trust deficit is addressed, it will be very difficult. And as I said, there are well-meaning people on both sides. It's not as if people are saying, we don't want to do this, but it will take a very disruptive reform to be able to pull it off. What bodes well for the future? I would say one thing that we are doing well in the education space, there are lots of companies which are pulling together stuff at the primary level, at the secondary level in school systems, getting kids involved in it. It's a very convenient platform for STEM because multidisciplinary You have to use your imagination. Teamwork is involved. There's a thrill of doing something hands-on and seeing when it works. And it's a good bridge between tech and culture, because the people who imagine these things are not necessarily the people who are writing the software code, right? It's a teamwork between people who say, I think this is what it should look like. And then somebody says, oh, I know how to pull this thing together and make it look like that. So I can't say that I see there are missions now that have been established. People have realized that in the government that robotics is going to be robotics, IoT, cyber physical systems. These are the future. They've actually budgeted huge amounts to go to various academic institutions. But this is the same thing that has happened in the past, that they go to academic institutions. It's not designed to see that the outcome finally will be something that will be commercialized. It's still at the stage where keep it safe. It's government money. Dole it out in small amounts to academic. They are the people who are the experts, so let them do it. So that is still not there. But as I said, the education part of it is something that I see as the future. You will get a lot of people, and I think some of the people in this audience are people who have gone through that process already, build small stuff, and then are now aspiring to build commercial systems and found companies doing that. So since that involves tech and culture, I think, Alex, you should have the last word on this in terms of what the future holds.
Thank you. Those were such excellent examples, particularly the one around the pizza delivery and the salad, and then some of the other ones around net houses and greenhouses in India. And I think what I'd like us to end on is to think about what kind of future is it that we're choosing, and if robots and cyber physical systems take a tremendous amount of investment and a broad skill set to make them viable, to really think about what's required there and what we are choosing to make viable. We are the ones that choose what we're going to invest in. Some of the topics that you brought up around advanced manufacturing and healthcare and agriculture and logistics and transportation seem to be the right areas. And when I say logistics and transportation, I don't really mean thinking about delivering hot pizzas directly to someone's door, which is a nice kind of pet project, but really not going to solve the types of problems that we have at the moment around feeding everybody, around climate change, around global logistics systems, et cetera. There are big things afoot, and we should be thinking about where we want to put our resources. And like consumer products are nice, but what do we really need to extend and replace human labor, and at what costs? And then how do we measure those costs and frame the most pressing applications and opportunities? So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to finally end with a question, which is, how can we account for the values and the costs of future robotics investments? And what tools do we need and what skill sets? Because as you mentioned, STEM projects are wonderful because they generally require a broad range of skill sets. And I was really inspired by the example that you gave around robotics to harvest coconuts, and that the problem was really cracked, no pun intended, by having people on the team that went and actually talked to the people and watched people climbing trees to see how you actually get up a tree, and then modeled that, modeled the successful design on that. And so what we need are people with really broad skill sets, or teams of people with really broad skill sets to develop these systems. And we also need to think about, when I say the costs of future robotics investments, to think about timeframes for these. What do we invest in now? And what resources are we using now? And what resources do we then leave for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren? So robotics, super important, really pressing issues in the world that I think we can apply them to. And let's really think about how we want to do that. And with that, I will go to the next slide that just says, thank you. And I think open it up for questions.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk, Dr. Raju, Dr. Zafaroglu. We had a couple of questions from the members in the meeting. So I'd like to request Rahat to kindly pose his question.
Namaste, everyone. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, dear professors. That was
Rahat, we're unable to hear you. All right, we'll come back to Rahat. In the meantime, Dr. Ramakrishna, you had a question as well.
No, I think Rahat may be back, or should I? I can wait.
Am I
if there is
audible
other
now?
people.
Yes, we can hear you.
Go ahead, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, my question is that could the idea of exchanging a human body with a robotic one while being alive be possible? Like just having a total transformation into a robotic body while having all human functionalities. So if a person is completely deceased and in the way of donating all his organs, can we just transplant the body with a robotic one? Do we see this happening in the future? I just want to know your insights, professors.
I'm pretty confident there'll be a movie about science fiction.
I mean, it's an interesting question about consciousness, right? And what makes a person and how many parts of a complex system you can replace before that complex system becomes something else. I really love the question as a provocation to think about, really, it's a nice provocation for thinking in systems and for thinking about what is replicable and what the relationships are between complex parts and where that actually breaks. So my initial response is like, no. And then I go, wait a minute, that's actually a really great question. And it was something that I think I don't have an answer for right now, but it's good to think with.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. And sir, could you just let me know the movie that you said, which is actually science fiction?
No, I was suggesting that somebody would make it, because this is imagination really that is the kind of imagination that starts people thinking, can we actually do it? I wouldn't have been able to imagine something like you just asked. Right? That's my limitation, but there are people who will have those, and then that will challenge us. We'll say, can we actually do something along those lines? Well, I mean, it will always start with the movie, because that's all, will actually get more people to participate in it and say, yeah, this is what it should be. Place out a scenario, basically.
It's an interesting question because there's already work being done to create continuations of people after they have died. So training models on the types of answers that someone will give, and then be able to do like basically chatbot experiences to feel that you're talking to the person because it's been trained, the system's been trained to sound like the person. And so you're really talking about a expansion of that idea. One of the methods that we used in the School of Cybernetics quite successfully to think through the implications of those types of scenarios is speculative science fiction and speculative futures, and then kind of future casting and back casting to see what would be the necessary steps to get to that particular future that you imagined. So that's why one of the reasons I was saying it's a really good question to think with. Because if you take that as your endpoint, you then have to say, okay, what are all the steps that would have to happen along the way? And then would we be willing to invest in that everything from what are our values, and I'm really going to shy away from the word ethics, but what are the things that we value that we would then want to invest resources and time and human energy into recreating that.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
A little over time, but if it's okay with our esteemed speakers, if we could have perhaps one last question. Vansh, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Sir, so you just said that the market for bipedal robotics is very pessimistic in India. But sir, like I saw that Boston Dynamics pod costs around $60,000 or 70,000 US dollars. So that is a lot, and it's specifically for research purposes and for military purposes. So sometimes robotics can be used for educational purposes as well as entertainment purpose. It can be also used for entertainment purposes. So sir, I saw that recently China just came up with another prototype of bipedal robotics. Basically, they named it Cyberdog, and it's a robot. It's basically a bipedal robot by Xiaomi. So they are selling the same thing for around $1,000. So sir, that is like 1/60th of the cost of the Spot, and it has more features compared to the normal Spot. Like Spot can't speak to you and even reply to your like if we consider Cyberdog, it's something very similar to Alexa. It can do backflips, plus it can answer your questions. So what do you think? Like, how will be the market for such kind of thing in India? Because sir, like when Cyberdog released on YouTube only, it just like the views touched like 2 million. So there is a lot of demand for such kind of science fictional things. There are people who are crazy for such kind of products.
Correct. So let me step back a bit. Boston Dynamics was recently acquired by Hyundai. And the transition, Boston Dynamics is doing a transition. They don't do any more military things. So Boston Dynamics has been acquired by Google, and then acquired from Google by SoftBank. And then SoftBank recently sold it to Hyundai. And the reason for this is basically that unless you have some civilian commercial applications, having a single customer, which is DARPA in the US, which funded a lot of the big dog, right, was not going to be viable. And Google realized it after a while, made the acquisition, sold it. SoftBank also thought that they would do something with it, realized that there was a Spot, by the way, it's not designed for military applications. So Boston Dynamics has gone away from a focus. So now their focus is warehouse applications, and you will have seen that they have got something called Handle, which is a biped, by the way, that does warehouse applications. And Hyundai was asked, why did you buy Boston Dynamics? And they said, well, we see applications for quadrupeds and all on a shop floor, where wheeled vehicles may not be able to navigate, that kind of terrain will be there, a few steps, a few cables in the way, and wheeled vehicles have problems. So they did see a use case for that, which is why they acquired Boston Dynamics. So Boston Dynamics has made a transition. It's no longer a military focused company. And iRobot realized the same thing, by the way. The reason they gave up PackBot, they didn't see a long, sustainable business model for them over the years. Once the Pentagon bought 500 of them, they didn't buy anymore, or 250. Some big number they bought, they didn't buy them anymore. The second thing about when you said, Xiaomi, which is Me is in every space, right? They make small scooters that run out, the people that run around in California are all made by Me, by the way. So Me has a model which says that we will do something with very little investment. And even if we sell only 1 million units, we'll have recovered that. So nobody can build something which is like a Spot or something unless they can sustain it for a very long time. And that's the reason they spend the money on it. So Me may be successful. And when I say pessimistic, I was pessimistic about using it for purposes other than just entertainment. right? Entertainment is one thing. People will buy them, maybe work with it for a couple of months, and then invariably they'll get tired of it. And if it's only that, right? I don't know how many of you have Alexa, but Alexa, I've noticed people use it for a month or so. After that, now Alexa is built into everything. So you actually use it to say, switch to Netflix or switch to that. But I'm not sure people who have bought it. I bought one for my parents. And after a while, they stopped using it. I mean, it's something that novel. Initially
I don't know. I keep thinking you're going to trigger my device in my house. Every time you say that name, I'm like,
that's right. Somebody is listening.
Right.
Someone
Yeah,
is.
yeah. In fact, there are privacy concerns, as you mentioned, no? That Alexa may be listening to what you're saying. So, there may be use cases, but there won't be commercially viable use cases. They will be, but it won't be sustainable. And most companies will look for something sustainable, not just for 2 years, but for 10 years. Because the kind of investments you have to make, you have to recoup it over many, many years. And I can guarantee the one from me, it's not going to be anywhere close to the kind of functionality that it may look that way. But after the second flip, third flip, something can go wrong. They're not built. It cannot be built for that kind of money to be that rugged.
Well, I guess, that note, Alex, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, I think we're already a bit over time, and I really appreciate everyone saying, shall I just go ahead and make closing the session? Okay. Thanks, Alex and Jagannath, for that fascinating kind of back and forth from this, different perspectives that you come from. And that was really the power of this session, I believe. And in me, I was actually wanting to ask a question, but the other people, were having questions. So it was inspired in me, something like, you mentioned, Alex, that, it could be like even another kingdom, like an animal kingdom, like a bacteria, plant, animal, and maybe out of the human, there's another seventh kingdom coming out. And, that's kind of a fascinating way of looking at it. How will it evolve? Is it, some kind of environmental, genetic, and this and that. So anyway, I was going to ask a question of that, but maybe that's for another day. That was very good. And Jagannath, I think you really, painted this picture of, from the Indian perspective, particularly what is relevant, what is important. And even Alex mentioned that, what are we going to be using it for? Is it to solve the grand challenges of society that you mentioned, Alex, or is it for some other more, not as meaningful an application? So I think that also kind of generated a lot of thought in my mind. Thank you so much again for really working over the past, couple of weeks, intensely on, this with us on this session, and I really hope that this will be used later for more educational purposes as well, because that's something that we at Plaksha was wanting to, hopefully use it for our students. I see some of our students were here and even asked questions. That was very nice to see that. And Alex, maybe it'll be a pipeline for eventually your School of Cybernetics graduate program that you lead there. Maybe some of our students from Plaksha eventually go to graduate work in the School of Cybernetics in Australia. Thank you again for thank you again for everyone for your participation in this, the audience, and please, there's one more session, the last one on October 26th on the future of technology education, which we are the last session that we are co-hosting with Carnegie India. So I welcome you all to look forward to that and hopefully join there as well. Thanks again, and then bye-bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.